She had nothing left but a pot of soup and 5 words. He had ridden through 3 counties without stopping. When she asked, he almost said no. What happened at that table in Deadwood changed both their lives forever, and nobody in that town saw it coming. The eating house sat on the far end of Sherman Street, past the assay office, past the last of the proper storefronts, past the point where Deadwood's main thoroughfare gave up pretending to be a civilized road and became simply a stretch of frozen mud that nobody had found a reason to improve. Nora Hadley had run it there for 3 years. A low-ceilinged room with 4 tables, a wood stove that listed slightly to the left, and a window that let in the morning light and very little else. She cooked what she could get and charged what people could bear to pay and kept the place open 6 days of 7 because the 7th was Sunday and she needed 1 day in the week that did not require her to be something for somebody. The town knew where to find her when they were hungry. The rest of the time they left her alone, which was what she had asked for and what they had mostly come to understand. Her husband, George Hadley, had died of a chest sickness the winter before last, 3 weeks after the snow came in off the Black Hills, and did not leave for 2 months. He had been a decent man and a poor carpenter, and she had loved him for 7 years. And when he was gone, she had looked at what was left, the eating house, a debt on the wood stove, and a town that regarded a widow without family the way it regarded an unbranded horse, with a mix of pity and quiet speculation, and she had decided to stay, not because she had nowhere to go, because leaving was what people expected, and she had stopped doing what was expected of her sometime around the age of 22. Every morning she lit the stove before first light. She was there when the miners came off the early shift, there when the teamsters pulled through from Cheyenne, there in the cold middle of the afternoon when nobody came at all, and she sat at the far table with her mending and the particular stillness of a woman who had made peace with her own company. The town had stopped wondering about her after the first year. She was simply part of Sherman Street, the way the mud was, and the noise from the number 10 saloon, and the smell of pine smoke that hung over Deadwood from October until April. He came through the door on a Thursday afternoon in November and stood just inside the threshold the way men do when they are not sure of their welcome. If this story already has you leaning in, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and never miss a single tale from the wild, breathing heart of the West. He was not what the town was used to seeing walk through a door. Most men who came into Nora's eating house arrived loud or desperate or both. Miners with their hands still black from the rock, teamsters with the particular stiffness of men who had been sitting on a wagon bench since before daylight, the occasional card player who had forgotten to eat for 2 days. They arrived with noise, with need that announced itself. This man arrived like weather. He was there before you had quite decided he had come in. He was tall, wide through the chest, trail lean everywhere else, wearing a long gray coat that had seen too many seasons to still have a color you could name with confidence. His hat was dark and pulled low, and his boots were the boots of a man who had covered serious ground on foot as well as horseback. He carried a rifle, muzzle down, easy in his left hand, the way men carry tools they have used long enough that the weight no longer registers. He stopped inside the door and looked at the room. 4 tables, 3 men at the near one eating in silence. The stove against the back wall, throwing amber light into the low ceiling, and Nora, standing behind the serving counter with a ladle in her hand, looking back at him without hurry. She had learned in 3 years of feeding Deadwood to read a man in the first 10 seconds. Not what he said, what his body said. Whether he held his shoulders like a man carrying something or like a man who had set it down, whether his eyes moved to the exits first or to the food. This one's eyes went to the food. She set the ladle down. Do you need food? He looked at her for a moment. The kind of pause that is not hesitation so much as the act of a man remembering how to speak to someone who is not trying to take something from him. Yes, ma'am, he said, if you have it. She had venison stew, cornbread baked that morning, and coffee strong enough to start a fire. She told him so. He sat at the table nearest the stove without being asked to, as though warmth were a thing he had been moving toward for a long time and had only just stopped resisting. His name, she learned from the way he signed the ledger she kept for credit accounts, was Edmund Cruz. She did not ask where he had come from. She brought him the stew and the bread and filled his coffee without asking whether he wanted it, because a man who looked like he had ridden through 3 counties without stopping always wanted the coffee. He ate. He ate the way a man eats when he is trying not to show how hungry he is, which meant carefully and with control, which only made the hunger more obvious to anyone paying attention. Nora paid attention to everything. It was the only way she had survived this long. He came back the next morning. She was at the stove when she heard the door. Not running late, not making noise, just the door opening and closing with the same quiet intention as the day before. And then the sound of boots on the plank floor, and then the chair at the table nearest the stove scraping back. She did not turn around immediately. She finished what she was doing, stirred the pot, tasted it, decided it needed another pinch of salt, and then she turned. He had his hat on the table beside him. Without it, his face was more readable than she had expected. He was younger than the gray coat suggested, somewhere in his middle 30s, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken once and set slightly imperfect, and dark eyes that had the quality of a man who had learned a long time ago to watch more than he spoke. "Morning," she said. "Morning, ma'am." She brought him coffee first. He wrapped both hands around the cup and held it without drinking immediately, the way a man holds warmth when he is not sure how long it is going to last. She noticed that. Over the following days, she noticed other things. He did not talk to the other men in the room unless spoken to, and even then he answered in the minimal way of someone who has spent a long time alone and is slightly out of practice with the rhythms of conversation. He always sat at the same table. He always arrived at the same hour, morning and evening, and he always ate everything she put in front of him with the methodical attention of a man who had not always had that certainty. On the 4th day, she set his plate down and said, "You are staying in town then." It was not a question exactly. He looked up at her. "Boarding at the Grand Union." He paused. Work came in. "What kind of work?" she asked. He looked at his plate. "The kind that starts and finishes in the same week," he said, without a crowd around either end of it. She understood that sideways through what he did not say. A man who preferred work without an audience. She thought about the eating house, about the way she had chosen the far end of Sherman Street, specifically, because it did not attract the men who liked to be seen. She thought she understood the arithmetic of it better than he probably expected. She refilled his coffee and went back to the stove without pressing further. That evening, after the last men had gone and she was washing the pots, she heard the door. She thought it was the wind off the hills working at the latch the way it did some nights. But when she looked up, Edmund Cruz was standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "I can bring wood in," he said, "if you need it stacked." Saw the pile was running low. She looked at him for a moment. "The pile is on the east side of the building," she said. "Axe is leaning against it." He nodded once. He went out. She listened to the sound of the axe in the cold dark and went back to washing the pots. If this story is pulling you in, hit subscribe right now. New Tales from the West every single week. Do not miss what happens next. The work he had spoken of, the kind without a crowd, turned out to be tracking. She learned this not from him but from Harlan Cord, the deputy who came in for breakfast on Fridays and talked the way men talk when they are not careful, openly and without audit. Cruz, Harlan said one Friday morning, looking into his coffee as though the information were floating there. "You know he used to ride scout for the Army? 3 years in the Montana Territory. Before that, Kansas." He shook his head slowly. "Man can follow a trail over frozen ground like it's a marked road. Sheriff's been using him quiet-like on the Tillman matter." Nora set Harlan's plate in front of him. She had heard of the Tillman matter, a freighting company owner, 2 mule teams, and a payroll that had gone missing somewhere between Rapid City and Deadwood 3 weeks ago. 3 men out of work because of it. A 4th man dead. She did not say she knew Edmund Cruz. She did not say she had been setting a plate for him twice a day for going on 2 weeks. She took Harlan's empty cup and refilled it and moved away, which was all the response the situation required. That evening, Edmund came in later than usual. He sat at his table, and she brought him what was left: venison and boiled potatoes and the heel of a loaf, and he ate in the particular silence of a man who has spent his day doing something that takes more out of him than he will admit. When she set his coffee down, she said, "Harlan Cord was in this morning." He looked up. She met his eyes and let that sit. He sets his fork down. "Harlan talks," he said. "Most men do," she replied. A pause. He looked at his coffee. "The Tillman job runs another week, maybe 2. Then you'll move on?" she asked. It came out more plainly than she intended. He looked at her steadily. "I don't know yet," he said. She went back to the counter. She was not entirely sure what she wanted his answer to be, which was itself information she stored quietly away and did not examine too closely. He stayed until the room was empty of everyone else, which had become a pattern. She had stopped pretending not to notice. He was not a man who crowded a silence. He let it sit between them the way you let a fire settle, not pushing it, not smothering it, letting it find its own level. When he finally stood to leave, he took his hat from the table and looked at her. "Good stew tonight," he said. "Deer came in fresh," she replied. He nodded once. He put his hat on. He went out. She stood at the counter after the door shut and listened to his boots on the frozen boards of the porch until they faded toward the street. And then there was only the stove and the dark and the wind off the black hills, finding every gap it could in the east wall. She picked up his empty plate and went back to work. The trouble came on a Wednesday, which was the day she baked. Nora had been up since 4. The stove hot, 2 loaves in the pan, and a third proving beside the warmth, when the door opened and the man who came through it was not Edmund Cruz. He was broad and red-faced and wore a fur coat that cost more than anything in Nora's establishment. His name was Clifton Price. She knew it the way she knew most things about Deadwood, by accumulation, by the fragments of conversation that settled in a room after the men who had been talking finished and moved on. Price ran 3 businesses on the north end of Main Street and was the kind of man who had decided early that success gave him the right to behave as though other people's time and property were simply resources available to him at need. He looked at the room with the flat, appraising expression of a man pricing what he sees. "I'll take the building," he said without preface, "the lot and the structure. My man filed with the land office this morning on a contested claim." He produced a folded paper and set it on the nearest table. "Says the ground lease your husband signed in '74 was improperly registered. Gives me standing to dispute the title." Nora wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the table and picked up the paper. She read it. She read it again. She set it back down. "You will want to speak with my attorney," she said. Her voice came out level, which surprised even her. Price smiled, the smile of a man who believed level voices in women were a sign of confusion rather than composure. "You don't have an attorney, Mrs. Hadley." "Not yet," she said. He picked up the paper. "I'll give you until Friday. After that, the matter goes to Judge Witten and you deal with it in his court, which I expect you'd rather not." He left. Nora stood in the empty room and looked at the door for a long moment. Then she went back to her bread, because the bread would burn if she didn't, and burning bread was a waste she could not afford. She was pulling the second loaf from the oven when the door opened again and Edmund Cruz came through it at his usual hour, stopping just inside with the quiet, measuring look he always wore in the first seconds of entering a room. He looked at her face, then at the table nearest the door where she had left the paper. He walked to the table and picked it up without asking. He read it. His expression did not change significantly, but something behind his eyes went still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. "Price," he said. "You know him," she said. "I know the name." He set the paper back down. He looked at her. "Do you have your lease papers? The originals?" "In the strongbox in the back room," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to see them tonight, if you'll allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "Stay for supper," she said. "I'll get the box after." The strongbox held 7 years of her life in paper. She set it on the table after the last men had gone, and Edmund sat across from her in the keep lamplight, and they went through it together. The original lease from 1874, George's registration papers. The deed of improvement she had filed herself 18 months after George died. the territorial office receipt stamp she had kept because she kept everything. Edmund spread the papers flat and read each one with the same focused quiet he brought to everything. Not rushing, not performing thoroughness, simply being thorough. After a time, he set his hand flat on the deed of improvement. This, he said, this is what Undo's prices claim. Your husband's original lease had a surveying error in the lot description. Northeast corner marker was off by 6 feet. That's what Price is working from. But your deed of improvement, filed in your own name after George died, was drawn against the corrected survey the land office completed in '76. He looked at her. You filed against the right description. His claim is built on the wrong one. How do you know this? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I spent a year in Yankton working land disputes for a territorial judge before I went north. He looked at the papers. Not law, exactly. Investigation. Finding what the filings said against what the ground said. Nora looked at him across the table. The lamp threw warm light between them, and outside the Black Hills wind was working at the shutters with its cold, steady fingers. You have done a great many things, she said. Not all of them worth repeating, he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes and did not look away, which she had come to understand was his version of honesty. Not confessing, but not hiding either. Who do I take this to? She asked. There's a land attorney in Rapid City named Sutherland, he said. Good man. Straight. He paused. I can ride there tomorrow. Bring him the papers. He'll know what to file and how fast to file it. That's 2 days of your time, she said. He looked at the papers rather than at her. The Tillman work is done, he said quietly. I have the time. Nora was still for a moment. Then she straightened the papers and stacked them carefully, and set them back in the strongbox and closed the lid. You'll want breakfast before first light then, she said. If you're riding to Rapid City. He looked up. I'll have the coffee on at 4, she said, and food for the road. He held her eyes for a moment, with the expression of a man who has been offered something he was not sure he had the right to take. Then he picked up his hat from the table. Thank you, Mrs. Hadley. Nora, she said. He stopped. My name is Nora. He looked at her in the lamplight. Edmund, he said, if you'll use it. She stood and carried the strongbox to the back room and did not let him see that her hands just slightly were not entirely steady. This stories is only just catching fire. Subscribe now, new stories from the West every week. Hit that bell and come back. You will not want to miss the next chapter. He was gone before first light. She heard his horse on Sherman Street in the dark, 4:15 by the clock on the wall, just as she had set the coffee and packed the food parcel, cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried elk, 2 hard apples. She had set it on the step without quite knowing whether he would think to look there. When she opened the door to sweep the porch an hour later, the parcel was gone. She went back inside and opened the eating house and did not think too closely about the road to Rapid City. Price came at noon. He came without the fur coat this time, in a black suit jacket, and with a man behind him whose function was self-evident. Large, still, positioned in the doorway with the deliberate presence of someone paid to be difficult to get past. Price himself moved through the room as though he owned it already, touching the back of a chair as he passed in the way of a man confirming an inventory. Is tomorrow, he said. I am aware of the days of the week, Nora replied. He looked at her with mild surprise, as though furniture had spoken. My attorney has the paperwork ready, he said. Judge Whitten will see it Monday. He paused. There is no reason this needs to go that far, Mrs. Hadley. I am offering a fair price for the structure and the goodwill. You would walk away with enough to resettle. He gestured at the room. This is a hard life for a woman alone. Nora set down the pot she was holding. She had been told variations of that sentence her entire adult life. You are too small for this, too female for this, too alone for this. She had decided, at some point she could no longer precisely locate, that the people who said such things were telling her more about their own fear than about her capacity. I am not alone, she said, and I will not be selling. Price looked at her steadily, then he looked at the man in the doorway. A calculation crossed his face. Not anger, which would have been simpler, something colder. Monday then, he said. He left. The man in the doorway left behind him, last slowly, with the particular message that slowness sends. Nora stood in the empty room. She was not afraid, exactly. She was the way a woman gets when she has already decided how a thing is going to go and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Edmund came back on Sunday evening. He came through the door with trail dust on his coat, and the particular kind of tired that settles in a man who has ridden hard both ways and considers it the appropriate cost of having done what needed doing. He sat at his table. She brought him coffee, and he held the cup the way he always held it. Both hands, warmth first. Sutherland will file Monday morning, he said. Before Witten opens court, he looked at her. It will hold, Nora. She set a plate in front of him. Eat first, she said. Then tell me everything. He looked up at her. Something in his face moved, briefly, like a shift of light across ground, and settled. He picked up his fork. Monday came in gray and cold, the Black Hills sitting heavy above Deadwood under a sky that had not decided whether to snow. Nora opened the eating house at the usual hour and cooked the usual things, and served the men who came in off the early shift with the usual quiet attention. And if her hands moved with more deliberateness than normal, it was the kind of thing that would only have been noticed by someone watching very carefully. Edmund was at the table nearest the stove with coffee and did not pretend to be elsewhere. He was simply present the way he always was, without making a performance of it. At 10 o'clock, Harlan Cord came in. He sat down across from Edmund with the look of a man who has news and is deciding how much of it to give at once. Sutherland filed, he said. Judge Witten reviewed it this morning before Price's attorney even got to the courthouse steps. He paused, then looked at Nora behind the counter. The deed of improvement held. Title confirmed in your name, Mrs. Hadley. Price's contested claim was ruled without standing. Nora set down the pot. The room was quiet. The three miners at the far table had stopped eating, listening, without quite admitting they were listening. Harlan continued. Witten wasn't pleased. Said if Price brings another action on the same grounds, he'll be looking at sanctions. He shook his head with the restrained satisfaction of a deputy who has watched a powerful man reach too far and come back short. Price doesn't lose often. He's not going to enjoy the experience. Edmund said nothing. He drank his coffee. Nora came around the counter and set a plate in front of Harlan without being asked. He looked up at her. On the house, she said. For the news. Harlan smiled. He ate. After he was gone, and the miners had gone, and the room had returned to its mid-morning quiet, Edmund sat alone at his table, and Nora came and sat across from him for the first time since the night of the papers. She did not have coffee or a task or a reason. She simply sat. He looked at her. What will you do now? He asked. Open tomorrow, she said. Same as always. He was quiet for a moment. And if Price finds another angle? She met his eyes. Then I will find another Sutherland. He looked at her with that expression she had learned to read over 5 weeks of twice-daily meals. Not quite a smile, but the country a smile comes from. The territory of it, open and unhurried. He turned his cup once on the table. I've been offered work in the spring, he said. Ranch survey work, east of the hills. 3 months, maybe 4. She kept her eyes on his. That is good work, she said. It is, he agreed. A pause. After that, it's open. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. After that, you'll need feeding, she said. His cup turned once more. I expect I will, he said. Outside, the sky over the Black Hills had made its decision. Snow began to fall, light and even, settling across Sherman Street, and the rooftops, and the frozen mud with the quiet patience of something that knew it had all the time it needed. Spring came late to Deadwood, the way it always did, grudgingly and without apology, the snow leaving in stages rather than all at once. The mud coming back before the green did, the Black Hills holding their gray for another month past the point when the lower country had already turned. Edmund left in the first week of April. He came in the morning before the eating house opened, which she had come to understand was his way of doing things that required some privacy from the ordinary world. He sat at his table. She made coffee. They sat together for a while in the early light. He did not say anything that needed to be said aloud, and she did not ask him to. When he stood to go, he held his hat in both hands. I'll write, he said, if that's all right. It is all right, she said. He put his hat on. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. You asked me something, he said the first day. Do you need food? She looked at him. I did need it, he said. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. More kinds than one. He went out. She stood in the doorway and listened to his horse on Sherman Street until the sound moved south and thinned and was gone. And then there was only the stove and the early quiet and the light coming in gold through the east window. He wrote from a ranch outside of Sturgis in May. 2 pages in a hand that was careful and slightly cramped, the writing of a man who had not written personal letters in a long time and was choosing each word the way he chose everything. Deliberately, without waste. He told her about the land, about the survey work, about a colt on the property that reminded him, without explanation, of something she had said in the winter about stubbornness being underrated as a quality. She wrote back. She told him about a new lease on the lot next door and her intention to expand the eating house into it before winter. About Harlan Cord eating her out of cornbread 3 Fridays running. About the way the Black Hills looked in June when the light came in from the west and turned everything gold and specific and entirely itself. He came back in September. He did not write ahead to say he was coming. He simply came through the door on a Thursday afternoon in the way he always had. Quiet, present, filling the threshold without crowding it, and sat at the table nearest the stove. She brought him coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Expansion's coming along," he said, looking at the framing visible through the door to the new room. "It is," she said. "Should be done by November." He nodded. He looked at his cup, then at her. "I thought about something," he said. The whole ride in, she waited. He set the cup down and looked at her steadily with those dark, unhurried eyes. "I would like to stay in Deadwood," he said, "if there is work." If, he paused, with the precision of a man landing a word in the exact place he intends it. If there is a reason to. Nora looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked. Somewhere on Sherman Street a horse went past at a walk. The afternoon light lay long and gold across the floor between them. "The expansion needs a good hand," she said. "Someone who knows how to build a thing that will last." He held her eyes. "I know how to do that," he said. "I thought you might," she replied. He picked up his coffee. She went back behind the counter. The eating house sat quiet around them in the September light. The new room opened beyond the door, the town outside going about its particular business, and the Black Hills above it all, vast and old, and entirely indifferent to the small, serious, necessary things happening at the far end of Sherman Street. It was enough. It was, in the way of all the best things, exactly enough. If this story settled into you the way the good ones do, this channel is your home. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and come back every week. Every story we tell is about the people the West almost forgot. We will not let them be forgotten. Stay with us.